Okay, sorry, I trolled everybody, but welcome to episode 3 of Rhythm Encounter, the RPG fan music podcast. For those of you who don't know, that little intro was part of the battle theme for Phantasy Star 3, which is today's topic. However, before I get to that, again, I'm Stephen Meyerink, Taylor's on the boards. With me today is my co-host,
Derek Heemsbergen, Embryon on the boards.
So the next 2 episodes are going to be a 2-part Phantasy Star retrospective, even though the series is still going. This episode focuses on the classic series, Phantasy Star 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the spin-off games that like 5 people have heard of. But before we get to that, we're going to have a shortened recent album section just because we're covering so much material today. And then we'll have a full news section and a full recent album section in the next episode, which will be the modern series of Phantasy Star, which is online, universe, portable, online too. So the first track we want to introduce today, Bob Richardson recently reviewed the FF Solo Guitar Collections Volume 2 album. There are 3 volumes of these, and they're different from the Final Fantasy Guitar Solo Collections, which is a completely different arranger doing the guitar. This one is done by Daisuke Minamizawa, and Bob and I agreed that this was some seriously fantastic music. I mean, they took some of my favorite Final Fantasy music and took some of my favorite Final Fantasy music and just did a really great job, transposing, I don't know what the word you would use, converting it to guitar. And it really sounds great. So go ahead and listen to it.
Got a very flamenco sound. That battle theme is probably my favorite FF battle theme. I know that's everything on the show was, this is my favorite. This is my favorite. It's so good. It's the best. I love it.
It's like I said last time, whatever I'm listening to right now is probably my favorite.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far, but the FF10 battle theme is really, really cool because I can listen to it on loop, whereas a lot of the battle themes, I hear it a bit and I'm like, all right, enough. But 10's is so good, and that's got a cool guitar sound, and I honestly had not listened to it before this very moment, so it was a pleasant surprise for me. I enjoyed hearing that.
Yeah, I liked it a lot too, and what's cool on the album is that there's a guitar arrangement of the Victory theme that comes right after this, and this track is built to bleed right into that after, so it's kind of cool how it flows right into the da-na-na-na-na-na.
Flawless Victory. And that also is really appropriate timing for the FF10 10.2 remaster that we just heard about, yesterday? Day before yesterday?
Very recently, which looks amazing.
It does. For all those people saying it's just a simple upscale, no.
Take a look at screenshots, man.
Yeah, there's screenshot comparisons out there, and they redid all those textures, and it looks awesome. I can't wait.
I loved Final Fantasy X, but it wasn't, in hindsight, it's not one of my favorites, but the combat in that game is rad, and part of the reason, I think, is because of the battle theme being... It's not lighter, but it has it's a little more airy, I guess, than the other ones. So it's easier to listen to over the period of 150 hours, grinding in the calm lands than I think some of the other battle themes in the series have been. Although I like others too. So.
And it's very apropos to the game's setting.
Without a doubt. So Derek, what do you think we should listen to next?
Well, how about the only other thing that we're going to talk about that isn't Phantasy Star today? The only other recent album we've got for you guys today is Steven just reviewed the soundtrack to Virtue's Last Reward
Whoop, whoop.
by Shinji Hosoe, and it is another excellent album. For those of you who are unfamiliar, that is the second game in the Zero Escape series, where your watch is going to kill you if you don't play the game right. So the track that we picked today is Bluebird Lamentation. It's a mellow piece that plays during a really heavy scene in the game. So get your Kleenex ready and take a listen to Bluebird Lamentation. Oh my god, when the music swells just under 2 minutes,
Yeah.
uh,
That
I cried during the scene that played it in the game.
that scene, I don't want to spoil it, of course, but it's one of the only tracks in the game that only plays in one spot, and that's because it's tied to a certain character. And it's just that scene, I didn't expect that particular branch of the plot to be as interesting as it turns out to be. And then at the end I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to cry. It's so sad."
Oh, I did cry. You were going to cry?
Well, I was getting there. Look, I reserve things for that, like Dumbledore dying, all right?
Nah, take it all the way. Wait a minute.
What?
Are you telling me that Dumbledore dies?
Yes.
Does Harry Potter kill him? Harry Potter's my favorite character in The Lord of the Rings.
I love that series. I especially like it when Sirius Black runs back to Helm's Deep.
Yeah, that's a cool part. And then he goes on the quest for the One Ring.
But we're not doing enough justice to how awesome the music from VLR is. I wrote in my review that I think with 99 and VLR, I really love the music, but I definitely think it's one of those cases where you will have a much better connection to it because of how closely tied it is to the fact that the game is a visual novel. This is one of the tracks I think that stands out, even if you don't know the context of the scene, because there's a lot of emotion behind it. But having played the game, it's undoubtedly more powerful because you have that. There's this one particular still image on the screen while the second half of this song is playing that's especially poignant. So if you haven't played VLR, play it because it's awesome. And if you haven't played 99, play that too. But the music especially, I think, even if you like Shinji Hosoe at all, it's worth listening to, but especially if you played the game.
And I think that's a good pick too, because the Virtue's Last Reward soundtrack is separated into two halves. One half of it is the music that plays while you're solving these puzzles, and each puzzle room has a different music track, and a lot of them are really cool, but they're also sort of like background noise.
Yeah, like you're solving a puzzle music.
Yeah, and then the other half are event songs that play during various discussions or for certain characters or whatever. So this is probably one of the strongest event themes. So I think it was a great pick, and the game is not to be missed. I'm sure you've heard enough raving about it. I think we awarded it Game of the Month and gave it a really good review. So
Yeah.
It's just so good. Go play it.
Pretty much everybody on site that played it loved it.
And really, I know you can play Virtue's Last Reward without playing 999, but seriously, play 999 first. Please don't. Please don't skip 999.
Yeah, it's
Do
awesome.
both. They're both good.
And plus, a lot of the music is remixed in VLR from 999, so you can't really appreciate how consistent the musical presentation is. One other thing I wanted to point out, too, regarding the FF solo guitar collections, those aren't available from your usual sources like PlayAsia because it comes with a guitar tab book. Those are available from Dice Gaming Namizawa's official page directly from him. That's where we got ours. So I'll be sure to have a link in the show notes for where you can find that. It's also in the review, so you'll be able to locate that if you're interested. It comes with the guitar book and all that. So just in case you were interested in listening to more of that fantastic music. So now we start a topic that since I was a little boy I dreamed about talking about. When I was 5 and I said, someday I'm going to get on the internet. What's the internet? And I'm going to do a podcast. What's a podcast? About Phantasy Star. And we were originally going to do this as one episode where we have the first half of the show be the classic series and the second half be the modern series. Then we realized we were insane. Just insane in the membrane.
Insane.
Yes,
Mostly
I'm insane.
Steven. I'll put myself in with that.
What it boils down to is that I'm frighteningly obsessed with this series. So it's the reason I got hired at RPG Fan. I originally wasn't going to get hired because they found other people to fill in the positions. But then I guess because I really loved Phantasy Star and our former editor-in-chief, Eric Ferrand, also loved it, he started messaging me on AIM, and they created a position for me that I no longer do. But not only is Phantasy Star pretty much my first RPG series, it's one of the reasons I think I'm an RPG fan, so I have to make sure it gets its due. And plus, Final Fantasy gets a lot of credit on the internet and all these other series, and Sega doesn't get enough recognition, I think, anymore. Back in the day they did, but with them being somewhat less prominent, I don't think they get enough recognition. So I really want to make sure we give you the all-encompassing Phantasy Star history episode through the music.
And we have a master historian on our side to explain why things are relevant and why they are what they are.
Yes.
So you're going to get a history lesson today in addition to your musical delights.
Yes, so let me oshiete you. That's Japanese.
Please do, Sensei Onegai.
So, obviously, we'll start with the original game in the series. This is Sega Master System Phantasy Star 1. One of the first, if not the first, console RPGs to have a female protagonist where the plot wasn't love or anything. It was good old-fashioned revenge. In the outset of the game, Alyssa Landale's brother, Nero, is murdered by the tyrant King Lassic, and the whole point of the game is to take Lassic down. And, in classic old-school RPG fashion, it turns out there might be a worse fiend behind the scenes. But what's interesting about this series is that the Master System had a different sound chip in Japan, or it had an extra sound chip, I think. It had an FM sound chip. So there's two versions of this soundtrack. There's the FM version, which sounds strange to my ear because I just didn't grow up hearing it. And there's the PSG version. I don't know what that stands for. I should have looked that up. But that's the version that if you've played the American versions of these games or any of the non-Japanese versions of this game, you'll be familiar with. So we'll start out. What we're going to do, since we have so many tracks and they're a little bit shorter, we're going to play them in blocks instead of one at a time. That way we just don't inundate with, well, that sounded cool. Okay, next. So the first tracks we're going to play is the overworld theme from the first planet, Palma, and then we're going to play an arrangement of that called Planet Palma from Volume 2 of an album Sega released a couple of years ago called Sega Rock, because I think I want to try to represent all of the different arrangements we have of these games. So first we have Palma, composed by Tokuhiko Uabo, and then we have Planet Palma, arranged on Sega Rock. So let's rock.
Jam out. That's some radical guitar. Very
Yeah,
much in the spirit of Sega rocking out in the 90s.
Sega always had that whole we can emulate rock music and to varying degrees of success, but it isn't very a far shot for them to create a rock arrange album of most of their games' music because I mean you play Space Harrier, you play Sonic games, they're made to sound like rock, if
Yeah.
not made by rock stars, like what the original Sonic was done by that Japanese rock artist. That what I really like is when that song breaks into the main melody, and then when it like around like 1:30 when it gets this into this like really brief solo, but it's just they capture that melody so well. I think that's why a lot of those 8-bit rock bands do so well these days because 8-bit music is so melody driven that it sounds great when you transpose it to like like an electric guitar or something.
Yep, I agree.
So you have those tracks, and now what I did with the next one is I wanted to capture there's a series of planets in all of the main Phantasy Star games that they exist in 3, but 3 is a sort of spin-off story. We'll get to that. But one of the planets you always go to is called Motavia. And in the first game, that's actually a planet you go to later, and it's like this dried up desert world. But thanks to the plot developments in 2 and 4, you start on Motavia actually, and it's become this green planet thanks to, again, various plot developments. But I wanted to try to capture every Motavia theme because it's interesting how they try to reflect the different tone of the world in each game. In this one, it's this kind of untapped desert, wildness. And then we have the main battle theme, which plays for almost every battle in the game, save one boss fight and the final boss fight. And then the 2 dungeon themes, because later on you'll hear, first of all, they're super catchy, and second of all, you'll hear them remixed in Phantasy Star 4, which is very cool, and then again in maybe Phantasy Star Online. So let's go ahead and take a listen to Motavia, Battle, Dungeon 1, and Dungeon 2. So for me, I really think Dungeon 2 is my favorite of those themes.
Agreed.
It's just, first of all, the first time I heard it was in Phantasy Star 4. And so when I went back, I was so young, when I went back and got a Master System and played it, I was like, oh my God, this is music from 4. Getting it backwards, I'm like, no, the 4 version is from 1. But this was, for me, one of the first times where I was seeing music in a series being carried on and redone. So it makes it feel really cohesive, which is cool because Phantasy Star 4 has probably the most direct ties to 1 out of any other game in the series.
Alice, after all.
And then, the battle theme, not one of my favorite battle themes in the series, but I mean, for the sake of completionism, you have to have it there. It's a little lighter than I would like, but again, that's, I like dramatic. I think it's definitely, I like it better than the Final Fantasy 1 battle theme, which I guess is the closest analog I can think to it, or the closest parallel.
That's your Phantasy Star fanboyism coming through. That's fanboy with a PH.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yeah.
This was my Final Fantasy. I didn't play Final Fantasy till 7, so.
Yeah, I agree. It's better. Probably, well, better than like the original version of FF1. FF1 has since been arranged so many times. But they are both good. And the final picks for Phantasy Star 1 today are going to be the final boss track, Dark Force, and a really cool rearrangement of it that was in the PlayStation 2 remake of Phantasy Star 1 called Phantasy Star Generation 1. So we are going to get devoured by some darkness here. Listen to Dark Force, and then listen to its smexy hi-fi brother. Still don't know how I made it through all of those first-person dungeons. I didn't play Phantasy Star 1 on the Master System, obviously, since I apparently don't know how to get the system right. But I played it on the GBA collection that came out way back. And somehow, with maps, I made it through the entirety of Phantasy Star 1 and beat it, which I'm still kind of impressed by. I impressed myself.
It's a pretty obtuse game.
Yeah.
Especially by modern standards, but even back in the day, there was some really out there stuff you had to do.
Yeah, well, I mean, I used a guide, but it's one of those games that I thought I would just never bother going through. But I did, and I was rewarded with the music for Dark Falls, which isn't amazing, but it was like, it's not the battle theme. This means it's intense.
Yes, only one other, I think there's a boss theme for King Lassic that's different from other themes in the game, other battle themes, and then Dark Falls, so I think this game is old enough that we can not worry about spoilers, but basically after you beat King Lassic, you go back to the governor's mansion on Motavia, and he's gone, and you fall into this mysterious level of the dungeon, and then you open this door with scary monsters on it, and Dark Falls shows up out of nowhere, and this song starts playing while the screen is all black. So it's really dramatic, because especially if you're playing this game for the first time, you're like, what's going on? I thought I won! And why is there a monster in the governor's basement? And
that's a question we will continue to ask for the rest of our lives whenever we play Japanese RPGs.
Touche. And I think regarding the arrangement, I like it a lot. I think the early parts of it are a little muted in terms of the melody and the instrumentation, but I really like that part that isn't in the original where they kind of arranged it a bit around 40 seconds. It feels like they got a little creative, but I think in general, the Generation 1 soundtrack hewed a little too close to the original. but didn't keep the same sound. So it seemed off to me. I don't know. Have you listened to any of the other stuff from Generation One, Derek?
No, just I've only listened to like the songs that we picked for today for the other games, but no, I haven't listened to any other Gen 1 stuff.
It's I don't think a lot of people were too happy with it. Also, they redesigned the characters to make them a little more chibi, and that it didn't really do
Yeah,
much for me. I was happy they remade it, but I was more happy that they were going to be remaking 4, which they didn't end up doing. But whatever.
which I'm so sad about. I remember wanting that so bad.
Me too, man. But in hindsight, they may not have done that great a job with it. But who knows? What one especially interesting thing is that the dungeon you fight King Lassic in, who's the bad guy for most of Phantasy Star 1, is called the Air Castle. And in Phantasy Star 4, you go back to that air castle, and you don't know why you're there, but when you're walking through a certain part of the dungeon layout from overhead in Phantasy Star 4 is identical to the dungeon layout in Phantasy Star 1's air castle. So they went back and recreated the first-person layout of the dungeon in third person from the overhead camera. So
That's
remember when I
super
found that out,
cool.
I was blown away because you wouldn't realize that because of the different perspective. When somebody pointed that out and showed the maps, I was like, my God.
That is super cool Easter egg.
I
I did not know that.
I think so too. And I don't know how commonly pointed out that is, but I think it's pretty rad. So there was only one Phantasy Star on Master System. Sega moved on to the Genesis, and you ended up with Phantasy Star 2, also by Tokuhiko Uwabo. And I tend to prefer the music in this one. It's a little more, I think it starts to hew a little more on the sci-fi side, which makes sense because the society has become more technologically advanced in Phantasy Star 2. There's this giant computer called Mother Brain that takes care of climate. It takes care of producing food. It basically coddles all the people, which plays into the plot of that when Mother Brain goes bad, everybody's like, oh, what do we do?
Oh, it's Final Fantasy 13.
Yes, actually.
I just kind of thought of that.
Just a lot sooner and with characters that I care about. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, sick burn. Hey, I like
I'm not
13.
going to hate on 13. So yeah, what's interesting about this one is that the Japanese version of the game has the same soundtrack, but the instrumentation's a little different because the sound chips between the Japanese Mega Drive and the domestic Sega Genesis were different. So on the soundtrack for the series, like this, all these tracks are coming from the Phantasy Star First Series Complete album. There's the original version of every track, and then there's the overseas version, which is the version, if you grew up playing these games in the US, that you'd be familiar with. And I don't like the Japanese version. There's this clap hi-hat sound that is so prominent in the Japanese version in every track that it's all I can hear. And that sound is still in the domestic version, but it's significantly lower in volume, so it doesn't stick out quite as much. So the first two tracks we're going to play are the Save Room theme, because that theme is awesome. And we're going to play the American version you're probably familiar with if you've played the series, and then the Japanese version just so you can hear the difference in sound quality between those. And then we'll break into some more discussion of the other tracks in the game, which are a little bit longer and a little meatier. So let's step up.
Step on up to step up.
Step up to the streets.
Step revolution.
So yeah, you can. I don't know about you, Derek. Can you? I'm sure you can hear the difference.
I wouldn't have really noticed if somebody just played it for me. Like they said, "Hey, do you remember this song?" And they only played the Japanese version. I would have been like, "Oh yeah, I remember it." But since we played them side by side, I recognize the difference. And if that is in every track, like you said, then it would drive me crazy.
It's super prominent, and I'm sure maybe if you played the Japanese version originally, it wouldn't bother you as much. But for me, I've played 2 so much and listened to the music so much that it's like in my brain better than things like my name. So the moment I hear some tonal difference, it's like, no, terrible, evil. It's kind of like with Skies of Arcadia on GameCube. Some of the notes got flattened because they compressed the music, and I heard it, and I was like, this is an abomination. I refuse to play it. But
That might be a little extreme, but I can understand where you're coming from. Take a drink.
yes, I mean, I'm totally extreme. I'm too extreme, like that game on PS1.
So extreme.
So let's listen to some more music. Derek, what do we got?
We've got some town themes and field themes. The next few tracks, we've got 3 here. We've got Pleasure, restoration, and yes, it actually is restoration, not restoration or castoration or manipulation or banana station. It's just restoration. And then finally, there is a field medley from the Phantasy Star Collection Volume 1 album that was arranged by Takanobu Masuda, and this was actually released prior to Phantasy Star 4, kind of to drum up interest in the game. So get your walk on, strap on your Nikes, and head out with these town themes. again with the 90s guitar at the end of that arrangement track.
I said that. I was talking to Eric, our old editor-in-chief. He was giving me some suggestions because this is one of his favorite series. And I go, gosh, these arrange albums sound so 90s rock. And he says, well, I mean, they came out in 93, so.
Well, yeah, duh.
That breakdown near the end is just awesome, though, when they just start wailing on everything. I'm like, man, just
cool.
unabashed crazy. That was what Sega was all about, man.
Yep, righteous.
That track, the version you just listened to, is truncated, actually. I cut off the second half of it is an arrangement of the second planet, or in Phantasy Star 1, it's the first planet. But you go to Deserus, or Desolus, depending on the translation, or Dezo, if it's Phantasy Star 2. And that's another world map thing that we didn't play here. But that's, if you listen to the full album on here, if you listen to it's actually the field medley, so you can hear an arrangement of that. And then I really, really like it's Pleasure, the town theme from Mota, and I just...
Yeah, as somebody who's barely played Phantasy Star 2, those are... Pleasure and Restoration are two of the only songs aside from the battle theme that I know. So those are good picks.
They're pretty notable. Just like with I included Step Up, the save theme, first of all, because it was a good comparison between the Japanese and the overseas version, and because our editor-in-chief, John McCarroll, the only music I've ever gotten him to listen to and comment on is the Shop and Save theme from Phantasy Star 2. So that one was for you, John.
We love you, John.
We do.
John and Nada.
So the next set of tracks we're going to go through is Advanced. Again, all these are the domestic U.S. version. Advanced, which is the first dungeon theme that you hear quite a bit throughout the game. And then Rise or Fall, two versions. First, Rise or Fall is the battle theme. The first version you'll hear is the original Sega Genesis version. And then you'll hear the Phantasy Star Generation 2 version just to see what they did with it or what they didn't do with it. Once you hear it, you'll kind of get the comparison there. So let's go ahead and take a listen. Advanced, Rise or Fall, and Rise or Fall, the arrangement.
Rise or Fall is a pretty easy song to get stuck in your head. I mean, it loops, but that's the only memory I really have of Phantasy Star 2 is just... I don't even think I got any... I only got 3 party members. So I had Rolf, Ney, and Rudo. Oh, I get it. Rudo. Eric. Got it.
Yep, that's why his name is Rudo.
Connection made.
Yep.
So I don't even think I got past the first or second dungeon in that game, but the battle theme is cool.
Phantasy Star 2 is labyrinth wise, not necessarily. I don't think combat wise, but labyrinth wise, it's probably the most difficult in the series because it's just they are
Yeah.
so winding, and like you'll have to go to the top of like a 10 floor dungeon and then drop down in an exact spot. It, it's
Yeah.
it's
No.
it's
Screw
heinously
that.
difficult. I
Yeah.
was telling Derek while we were listening, I played them in a weird order. I remember I went out and I was super excited to buy what I didn't know was Phantasy Star 4 because I've been playing it on Sega Channel. And so I finally got the money, bought it, ended up buying Phantasy Star 3, which at the time I was rather irritated about. And
I
then
would still be irritated about it. Sorry.
I I ended up a couple of months later, my uncles used to live with my family, and the room they lived in, they shared a bunk bed, and there was like these wooden slats on the above the first bed. And so I was jumping on that bed because I was a fool, and one of the slats came loose and smacked me so hard in the head that A, it knocked me out, and B, it like I had to get stitches. And so they told me, oh, you can't run around outside. You have to like not move your face much or you could rip the stitches. So I was super bummed out. So my mom took me out and I finally got Phantasy Star 4 and it just freaking blew me away. So I didn't finish 3 or 1 until way later when it came out on GBA. And then I didn't finish 2 until it was on iOS. I finished it in 2010. So it took a long time, but I played them all a lot, but I never finished them all until much more recently. And just Rise or Fall has always been, it feels so important. It's just, it really gets you into that game. It's one of my all-time favorite battle themes. And I think I may actually like it better than my favorite game in the series 4's regular battle theme, just because it's
What?
no, really. I love Four's battle theme, but Rise or Fall it's like man, it makes you feel like there's justice behind those buyer monsters that you're smiting, or the
Yeah.
robots later.
And I would argue that it's also the most iconic song of that game. So
Oh yeah, definitely. I
it's
would.
probably part of it.
I On that note, I don't know about you, but I don't really like the arranged version in Generation Two. I appreciate that they went through and redid the music, but they didn't really do anything to it, and the instrumentation just kind of takes away some of the punch of the original, I think.
I thought it was okay actually, but you're right that they didn't add much. I felt like it was a solid recreation in a higher fidelity, but
Yeah,
and they could have taken advantage of that to spice it up a little bit, but sometimes it's not needed. So I don't really have any feelings about it one way or the other. It was there.
yeah, that's true. In general, the remake of 2, I think, was better than the remake of 1 because it was a little bit truer to what the original game was. But so for our next group of tracks, we have Mystery, which is a dungeon theme from late in the game, Noah, which is the final dungeon theme, and in Japanese it's called Under because the dungeon had a slightly different name, and then Death of Place, which is the only other battle theme in the game. It plays for every boss fight, all 4 of them. I think there were 4, yeah, or maybe even 3. But it's the only boss theme. It's the Nii First boss theme. It's the Dark Force boss theme. It's the Mother Brain boss theme. So it's special because you fight a lot of battles in that game, and it's different, but it's also not like, oh man, the final boss has his own track. So let's go ahead and take a listen to Mystery, Noah, and Death of Place.
Nay, open your eyes, please. No,
Iris!
not gonna.
Iris, open your
Iris!
Iris!
What am I for?
I'm glad
That went in unexpected direction.
but I'm glad we were able to link that together
Yeah.
and sync up so well. That was good. But yeah, Phantasy Star music is cool. I really like mystery. It's you said it you said the exact same thought I was having, which is it sounds like a 90s action anthem. Like the heroes have recovered from their mid-movie, slump, and they're like, all right, let's go take on the bad guy. Yeah, it definitely, you really get that sense that Sega and Genesis was going for that, like, really hip, like, this is the stuff you see in pop culture kind of sound.
Like put on your sweatbands and your bright pink booty shorts and
Throw some pogs.
Load your gun and let's get going, man.
And then watch Fresh Prince.
Yeah.
I said wash at first. I don't want to wash Fresh Prince.
You could wash the Fresh Prince. I mean,
But he's already fresh.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it would be kind of redundant to wash the Fresh Prince.
Yeah, so...
And his wife wouldn't appreciate it, but go on.
And Noah is the final dungeon theme, and as final dungeon themes go, first of all, it's not the best one in the series because 1 doesn't have a final dungeon theme, it just has Dungeon 2, which is awesome. 3 has literally the standard dungeon theme, and then 4 is the only other one with a real final dungeon theme, and it's so good and so different from what you've heard in the series before that I don't think Noah really keeps up. But, as an early prototype, this was 1989, I believe, so this was really early in the JRPG, so at least for me. So this is, I don't think Final Fantasy 1 had a final dungeon theme either, because you just went to the Chaos Shrine again. But I don't know. It's pretty cool as a piece of history. It's not one of the most memorable songs, but I think it's worth having.
And it's called Noah, which is a throwback.
Yes, because in Phantasy Star 1, he was called Noah. He was your mage. In Japanese, he was called Lutz, which is what they retconned it later. But they didn't change that he was called Noah. They just said that was his name via Phantasy Star 4. But this was actually the name of the spaceship that you're on, which turns out to have a bunch of Earthlings and Dark Force on it. So it's not the coolest spaceship in the world.
I hate it when that happens.
Yeah. And the Death of Place is pretty good, too. It's, it has that... You've fought so many battles throughout the game that it has that it's different, so you're excited to hear it. But it's still, you don't have a final boss theme, which is interesting because it's kind of a step back from Phantasy Star 1, which had its own final boss theme. But I read a lot of stuff that 2 and 3 were both pretty rushed. So it may have just been that this is the battle theme we got because of space limitations on the cartridge or whatever, because that's why you don't have battle backgrounds in Phantasy Star 2, because of space limitations on the cartridge.
Yep. It's just kind of weird. That's one of the few things about Phantasy Star 2 that I notice every time I try to play it. I'm like, it's so weird to just have like the wireframe and nothing else.
You're fighting in the Lawnmower Man's world?
Yeah, absolutely.
I
just got sucked into Tron.
And that's what's interesting too, is that the only boss in the game that kind of circumvents that is the final boss, Mother Brain. She has like space flying in the background and stuff, and she takes up the whole screen. So it's pretty cool. But in the remake, they actually did have battle backgrounds, and it's almost off-putting because it has like a totally different vibe. Because you're like, wait, there are trees and sky in the back.
Yeah.
What?
You're like, where am I?
Yeah, it really does give it a different vibe. But Phantasy Star 2, good music, some classic stuff. I mean, they packed it in with the Genesis for a long time, so a lot of people are very well beloved on that game. A game a lot of people are not very well beloved on, maybe because of how different it is from the rest, and because it tried some stuff that it didn't totally succeed on, but it's still a very solid game if you can give it a chance and get over some of its flaws, is Phantasy Star 3, Generations of Doom, the only game in the series other than 4, which wasn't actually called 4 in the US. The box said 4, but the game is just Phantasy Star End of the Millennium. Phantasy Star 3 has a subtitle, which is Generations of Doom, which plays into the whole system of at the end of every part of the plot, you choose who you're going to marry, and then you get a completely new protagonist in the next generation, and they branch out. So you do it twice. So your third generation character can be the combination of a lot of different people, and it dictates his abilities and the other characters you get in your party, and even some of them have different endings, which is really cool.
That blew my mind when I was a kid, for sure.
Yeah, and it's very forward thinking, and they switched to a new composer for this one. It was Izuho Numata. Her maiden name was Takeuchi, but in the game you would know her credited as Ippo, which is what it says in the Phantasy Star 4 sound test. And what this game tried to do, actually, we'll talk about that after we listen to this first set of tracks, because it's more visible than the others. We're going to start with the main theme, which is pretty iconic and has been remixed on several albums. And it's really a great theme that they revisit several times throughout the game, so I think it's important to have it here talking about it. And then the first town theme, which is like a minute long, and then the second town theme, which is like 30 seconds long. And just because of what a drastic contrast there are. And you can see here kind of, this is the same composer that did Phantasy Star 4, which shocks a lot of people because in terms of the time they had and her mastery of the hardware, you really can see an evolution. So some of the melodies here are good, but they use the power of the Genesis for evil, and they hit some of those notes that are just a little bit sour, and like, you can really see the technical limitations coming up. But I'll be interested to hear what you think of it, Derek, because I am including this music for history purposes and to show that there's actually a lot more to like about this game than you might think. But I think
except playing it.
no, it's not that bad. Oh, we'll talk about that after. But main theme, Town 1, Town 2. Yeah, so I think you can tell, especially with Town 2, first of all, I really like the melodies here, but you can tell that, I don't know if it was because they were rushed or because Numata was just new to the hardware or something, but it's a little more difficult to listen to in terms of the instrumentation. It kind of misuses some of the sounds. Like, you get the good melody there, especially with main theme. I think that sounds great. You have like the bell in the background and stuff, but with Town 2, you have that burn. It's kind of dissonant, and I don't know, it's a little jarring.
It feels really foreboding. You mentioned that's a song that plays when you're in towns that are not friendly, yeah?
Yeah, like there's this war going on between Orakians and Lanes, which are basically in the history of Phantasy Star 3, which it turns out, at first it doesn't seem related because it's very medieval. It turns out that in Phantasy Star 2, one of the planets gets destroyed and all these giant colony ships evacuate. And as they're evacuating, they go out to different parts of the universe. And you find out late in Phantasy Star 3 that you're on one of these ships. So it is related. It's kind of like a side story. And so on your ship that you're on, there was this war between this warrior named Orakio and this other warrior named Leia, and they divided the people into two, like Orakians and Layans. So you start out, you're a full-blooded Orakian. So when you go to like a Layan town, it plays that just to kind of express that you're not in your kingdom anymore.
Which is good because it's always cool when music plays into the context of what's happening.
Which is
And
something
I did not know that about the story actually, so I appreciate hearing that as well.
Yeah, it's well, that was the thing is a lot of people started playing and they go, "This is medieval," and it's the music is different. It's a very different vibe from the other ones, and I think that's why a lot of people don't like it. That and certain experiments the game tried out just didn't work out. Like the graphics are a little bit dry and kind of colorless, and I think that's what drove a lot of people away was that, and it didn't seem to be related to the others. And then even then, once you find out, it's like, oh hey, we're one of the Palman ships that blew up, and there's a dark force on here. That's what's causing the final boss song is Cause of the Dark, and it's the cause of all the problems. So it does relate in to the whole thing, and it creates a plot thread that becomes picked up in Phantasy Star 4, because 4 mentions the ship, and they tell you later Dark Force is this entity that gets reincarnated every 1,000 years, and it can be reincarnated more than once, and that's why 3 is happening in parallel to Phantasy Star. I think it was 4, or the events are happening in parallel, so you have two dark forces existing at once, and that's the start of an idea that plays out in Phantasy Star 4, where there are 3 dark forces that you fight on your own, and then you find out what's causing all the dark forces, which we'll get to when we talk about Phantasy Star 4. It's very tied in. It's not as immediately apparent. Kind of like King's Quest 3. You start out, you're not a king or a prince or any kind of royalty, it seems like, and it doesn't, until the end of the game, you don't realize that it is tied in. It's just not immediately apparent.
You would make a King's Quest reference.
This is my childhood episode, man.
All right. Another thing that Phantasy Star 3 did with experimenting is it did experiment with its musical themes. So two examples of that are the field music, the ground, and the battle music. The field music actually changes depending on how many people are in your party, while the battle music changes depending on how difficult the encounter is perceived to be. So we have both of those. We actually have that you're going to hear a progression through both the field music and the battle music, and then we'll come back and chat about how that works. So coming up next, we've got the ground and battle themes.
Oh, wait, bad.
I sound like Strong Bad. System.
Anyways, Phantasy Star 3, go!
Phantasy Star, here we go. In the ground, what stood out to me was the part at the end that plays when your main character is dead, but everybody else is alive. That is weird
It's
that
cool.
they made that. Yeah, it is cool. Well, cool and weird are pretty much the same for me most of the time.
Touche.
But yeah, that's a surprise. So I think that's actually a successful venture in terms of musical experimentation. They didn't add a ton of instrumentation throughout those tracks as you progress with party members, but the fact that they did anything at all is cool, especially with such limited hardware.
I think you'd
And
find too, if you listen to the full track, especially as you get from solo to trio to quartet and quintet, which are the different versions of the theme. We only played the first 10 seconds of the first four. There actually is quite a bit of, you can see how much more they added to each track. Like you'll hear a certain channel added every time. And it really gave you kind of a cool impact because when you earn new party members in that game, it was sort of a big deal because they made the game a lot easier. And it was just neat that they had that. And if I could be wrong, I'm pretty sure the version that plays when your main character is dead is an arrangement of the game over theme because your protagonist is exceptionally important in the context of the story. So it makes sense that if that person were to die, it would be really bad.
we wouldn't want that.
No.
And so for the battle themes, those also change dynamically depending on the difficulty of the battle. So there's that awful grating like 2 second loop.
But
But
that's what I
the
brought the show in because I think that's for a lot of people. If you sit on the intro to the battle, it just keeps looping that until you start doing something. So for a lot of people, they were like, "Are you kidding? This is the 3 second loop."
yeah. But the rest of the changes are interesting. I like the normal one probably the most. And then the hard version, Steven, what does that sound like to you?
It in the hard and easy, and you'll see again in the Dark Force track. It sounds like somebody took a card and sticked it into the spokes of your bike. It's like in the background, and I'm like, "What instrument is that supposed to be?"
It is very odd.
Like what? Like what are you doing with the Genesis hardware? Especially since you're going to go make Phantasy Star 4 later. You're like, what? I want to chalk it up to this game having been rushed. And maybe Numata just didn't have enough time to kind of get things where they wanted to be. So it sounds good, but some of them just had that really grating sound.
But it still did something that a lot of other games didn't do at the time with changing the music for various situations. Other games since then have attempted to do that. A couple that come to mind are Final Fantasy: The Four Heroes of Light does that in battle. Like if you're about to die, then the music changes suddenly to like a more ominous version. And more appropriately, Phantasy Star Online 2 does that, as I am told.
It was interesting because I found out when I reported on the sympathy show that we'll talk about later, the orchestral concert they're doing. I was like, why is it called Sympathy? Is it sympathy for the fact that they're not going to make any more classic Phantasy Star? What is this? It's because the music, the procedurally generated music system in Phantasy Star Online 2 is called Sympathy. And it generates, there's like 9 different versions of every boss theme for like if you break off the boss's arm or if you hit his eyeball or something. So and I think, I could be mistaken, but I recall reading that Hideki Kobayashi, who did the soundtrack for that NPSO1, said, I was inspired by Phantasy Star 3's creative use of sound. So the series is still connected. It's like they're still looking back a little bit. So I really kind of appreciated that, and I really like that they're bringing it back in PSO2. Maybe not necessarily in the same way, and certainly, more technologically advanced in how it's executed, but interesting little bit.
But the idea is in place.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's pretty cool. I also think it's pretty cool. We're going to play next. It's Sierran Type 386, which is the airship theme, which, forgive the first 5 seconds, they're incredibly like, wow, but the melody is cool and it gets good. And then we're going to play the Phantasy Star Collection Volume 1, that Arrange album from the 90s, a version of that, because I think this is just a really cool, upbeat song. The reason it's called Sierran is in the English version, you wouldn't know this, but in the English version of Phantasy Star 3, you got an android named Ren. And in Phantasy Star 4's English version, you also got an android called Ren who looked identical, but he was said to be a newer model. They're not the same character, though, because in Japanese, Ren was called Sierran in Phantasy Star 3, and Ren in Phantasy Star 4 is Furen, which is like a more advanced model. So that's why in English, it's like, why are these two characters who look identical and have the same name, but they don't have the same memories, and how are they in different places? And it's because they have different names. So kind of interesting.
More history lessons from the PS Sensei.
I like being called that. But anyways, let's go ahead and take a listen to Sierran Type 386 and the arranged version from PS Collection. Yeah, I really like. First of all, again, I apologize. The first 5 seconds of the original track are a little bit like it's just like this disaster of Genesis sound, but I think the melody is really cool there, especially at the end when you get around like 48 seconds. It's got that like that background going like like I really, it's just it's fun. Like when you get the airship in that game, it's a big deal because exploration in that game is tedious. So being able to fly around all of a sudden on your android is pretty rad. He turns into a jet, so he's kind of like, well, that's too recent of a game. Never mind. He's like another game where there's a character who can turn into a jet, who is better than Derek's favorite character.
Wrong. It's cool. It's a cool exploration theme. I'd like to troll you a little bit every now and then. There was definitely the once again super wailing 90s righteously rocking guitar in the rearranged version, but
Yeah,
both very cool.
that album it really does encompass that whole Genesis thing like that Sega went through. Like I said it earlier, like Genesis was if you wanted rock and like pop and stuff, you were on the Genesis. If you wanted like boodly boodly boo, as Sega marketed it, you go with Nintendo. If you wanted the badass stuff, you went with Genesis, which to varying degrees of success for some people. I grew up with it, so I buy into it. But
Yeah.
what do we what's our last set of tracks from Phantasy Star 3, Derek?
To close up Phantasy Star 3, we've got the Dark Force track, Cause of the Dark, and Ending 2, Start Anew. So these are the things that you hear at the very end of the game, and by that point, you're either sad that it's going to be over, or you're ready for Phantasy Star 4, like I know I would be, although I hardly played Phantasy Star 3. I just got to jab a little bit. I appreciate what Phantasy Star 3 does, I really do. But these are the last two tracks, Dark Force 2, or Dark Force and Ending 2, Start Anew. Let's get dark. For Dark Force, you remember that analogy you made about the wheel and the card and the bike wheel spoke?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that bike is now being ridden by Satan, and he's gonna come and annihilate your entire family.
And just like in Phantasy Star 2, you find Satan in a box. For some reason, in Phantasy Star 2 and in 3, you find Dark Force inside a box, and he's like, "Wah! You opened Pandora's box. I'm evil. I'm going to kill you." And then he pops up, and you're like, "Wait, how did you fit in that box, bro?" But yeah, the Dark Force in Phantasy Star 3 is terrifying looking.
He's creepy.
Yeah, I showed Derek a picture of it while we were listening to the track, but I really like that final boss theme. It's, forgive me for saying this, but it's really dark. It's much more, since he didn't have his own theme in 2, and 1 had kind of that, that peppy 8-bit sound to it. This is the first time you're fighting Dark Force when he's like, man, this guy is like super evil, and it's like that really, those very deep, dark beats on the Genesis that I think, maybe if you don't like Genesis sound, you may not appreciate that boss theme, but that's a pretty intense theme for a game at this point in time. So
Yeah, it's kind of nightmarish.
yeah, which is sort of the case because you don't know he's the cause of the problems, but you just know that if I recall with 3, you fight this corrupted king in this evil city, and then you go into like the underside of the city, and that's where you find the box. And I think Dark Force is in there because they've told you at that point that, oh, King Rulikir was corrupted by Dark Force, so go take this guy out. He's mean, and he's causing all the problems on our ship, the Elisa 3, which the ship is called the Elisa 3, and the reason is because in Japanese her name wasn't Elise in Phantasy Star 1, it's Elisa. So that's why there are all these references to Elisa, and that's why where the confusion came from with Elise in Phantasy Star 4, because it's not the same person at all. And then I really like that ending theme. There's 2 ending themes because there's 2 different endings, they vary depending on your characters, but I feel like that really gets this. It sounds so Genesis, and I've said that a couple of times, but it really does. It's this really nice denouement at the end of this long and particularly arduous and time-consuming adventure, because PS3 is really time-consuming.
Well, I like that you said denouement.
Yeah,
that was very fancy of you.
Yeah, well,
But it's a nice contrast to the horrible dark death of Dark Force. Then you're like, oh, start anew. All right, adventure's over.
The endings are pretty cool actually, because in Phantasy Star 2 you get a technique called Megid, and it hurts your own party and the enemies, and it's incredibly powerful, but you can pretty much kill yourself with it. In 3, it becomes part of the plot. You have to get it. You have to learn that and some other skills to fight to be prepared to fight the final evil. But you can't actually use it. It just sits in your menu. But then in one of the endings, your character gets so angry at how evil everything is that it triggers the technique, and he like blows up the city. So it's pretty cool. And then in Phantasy Star 4, it comes back as like an optional thing you can get in a side quest. But I thought it's really cool that one of the endings is basically, it's your character just getting so overwhelmingly angry that he blows up the city and almost kills everybody, and somebody else has to save you.
It's really unconventional, and yet another example of Phantasy Star 3 doing something oddball, but it being cool.
The translation's pretty bad, though. It's like, this city is so evil, I hate it, and his anger triggered Megid. So,
Oh, well, you can read between the lines,
Yeah,
You had to have some imagination at the time, because a lot of translations of games in that era were awful.
Pretty.
Breath of Fire 2, for example, but anyway.
Yeah. So the next section we're going to talk about, somewhat unexpectedly, because you would think I'd want to get right into Phantasy Star 4, but because I want this to kind of encompass everything classic Phantasy Star, there are some very relatively unknown spin-offs to Phantasy Star. There's 2 Game Gear games. There's Phantasy Star Adventure and Phantasy Star Gaiden. And Phantasy Star Gaiden, I'm not sure if I'm getting these right. I played them a long time ago. Gaiden is a spin-off, as if Elise left the Algo system and found another solar system, and then Adventure is like an unrelated tale that I think ties into Phantasy Star 2, I believe. And then there's Phantasy Star 2 Text Adventures, which were released. The other ones were on Game Gear. These ones were released on the Sega CD Genesis MegaNet modem, which was never released in the US, but it was sort of like this. It's kind of like the Nintendo Satellaview, where you would download games. And so they had these text adventures that focused on each character from Phantasy Star 2. And they've been fully translated. They're never going to come out here, but you can read translations of them on the internet, and they're pretty neat. They give you, more background on the characters, like how Sheer the thief became a thief before Phantasy Star 2 and that sort of thing. So I'm going to play 3 tracks from those. The first one I'm going to play is the Desolus theme from Phantasy Star Adventure, because we're not featuring any other Desolus overworld themes on here, and because I think it's just an incredibly gorgeous piece of music by Kenji Yamazaki that is just really memorable. I remembered it from this game, and I remember very little else from it. And then I'm going to play the overworld theme, most of it from Phantasy Star Gaiden, because it's like 7 minutes long. Shockingly for a Game Gear game, for any game at that point in time. And then I'm going to play Eustace's Adventure from Phantasy Star 2 Text Adventures. And Eustace was the Japanese name of the protagonist, Rolf, in Phantasy Star 2. So we're going to go ahead and take a listen to those real quick, and then when we come back, it'll be time for the greatest RPG of all time. I really, really like Overworld. I enjoy it. It's memorable from that game, but not maybe in the grand context of all of the game music. But the Desolus theme and Useless Adventure, I really, really like those. Desolus just has this crazy, peppy, happy sound to it. Like, oh, we're out exploring and everything's great, even though that planet is a frigid wasteland. And Useless Adventure just has that really cool like bass, because that's the highest quality of the songs, because that one came from a Genesis / Sega CD. So you have that like da na 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 with that really cool bass in the background, that a sound I really typically associate with Sega CD games. So I dug it.
As did I. That's my first time hearing any of those, and it was cool to hear the progression from a Game Gear track to a Sega CD track. And it also makes me wish we had the opportunity to play those, much like a bunch of the other kind of side games. Like when I think of these, I always think of like the Phantasy Star spin-offs and the Lunar Magic School side games.
Yeah, like those really rare games that nobody.
Those like rare text adventure things. 'Cause I was always like, oh, I love these series and I'd love to explore more of it, even though I just said I barely played 2 and 3, but I was like, oh God, I love 4, but we're about to get there. But I think that those are cool tracks, and it was a good segue for us to get in from 3 into 4.
Yeah, and one other thing that I found interesting about them, well, maybe not interesting, is that if I recall, Adventure's pretty good, Guidance pretty bad. They don't play very much like Phantasy Star 2. They play more like 1, but with a very, very limited set of hardware. Like Gaiden, the battles, like the menu takes up 3/4 of the Game Gear screen, and the bad guy is like just this image in the top tiny little top right corner. So they don't give you any sort of deeper understanding, Gaiden and Adventure, to the characters in the main series. The only ones that I think are particularly interesting plot wise are the text adventures, because they flesh out the Phantasy Star 2 characters.
Yeah, I was just reading a summary of those, and I like that it shows like what happened to Nay before she before she met Rolf. Rolf, and before Rolf moved out of the neighborhood that Ed and Eddie lived in.
Yeah, or before he moved in with the Muppet Babies.
Yeah, that guy gets around.
He does, doesn't he? Rolf.
Rolf.
The guy Rolf. I want to know what the localization meeting was. Well, what sounds like useless? Rolf.
Yeah, same thing.
Like it's like, oh yeah, what is he, rolling on laughing floor or something? I don't know.
Rolling on laughing floor.
I don't know. Whatever. It's translation foibles. Chaz is Rudy. Rudy actually sounds cool, especially after Wild Arms, but whatever.
Yeah, Rudy's cool.
Speaking of Chaz, Derek, hit us.
Okay, this is the moment you've all been waiting for. I know it's the moment we've been waiting for. We move from the earlier games into the granddaddy of Phantasy Star's main series. Unfortunately, the very last game that we've received up until this point. And we're really sad about that. But nothing can take away the happy memories we have of Phantasy Star, the End of the Millennium, and also called Phantasy Star 4 on the box, even though that's not technically in the name. This was also scored by Ippo from Phantasy Star 3, and it's a huge departure from Ippo's style. And some of the tracks were also done by M. Nakagaki, also known as Gaki-chan. So Phantasy Star 4 has a ton of incredibly memorable music, and I know that a lot of you will recognize this stuff.
When we were coming up with the track list, my original cut of the Phantasy Star 4 one, I texted Derek, I go, is it okay to have 37 tracks from Phantasy Star 4? And he was like, it was the nicest yes phrase no I've ever had. It was, yeah, I guess. The subtext was no. So
that might be too many.
It was really hard to pare this down, because I wanted to include everything.
But we've done our best to pick out a lot of the best ones. The best, it's all the best. So the best of the best.
Yes,
the cream of the cream of the crop.
The most representative of Phantasy Star 4. Some of the the cool stuff, and the stuff that has parallels in earlier games.
Right. And if we missed something that you love, we're sorry, but we had a hard enough time, so don't beat on us for it.
Yeah, just go find the album. It's out of print, but
no problem.
It's available for $200.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or just boot up your Genesis and give it a listen.
Yeah.
So we open up with the opening track to the game, of course, and when you put this in your system, you are ready for that grand space-spanning adventure. Take a listen to The End of the Millennium, Phantasy Star 4. That is such a badass opening theme.
That's the only way to describe it. That's like Sega was sitting there going, "Yeah, we did rush the last two and all that, but you know what? Right from like you hit the Genesis button, and before your finger is off it, it's like boom, just freaking explode." Oh,
Yeah.
yeah,
Explodes with awesome. It's like space rock taken to the extreme. Song gets me so pumped. And actually, as we were listening to this, I mentioned to Steven that I have not played Phantasy Star 4 in so long that I don't remember anything after the point where you get Ren. And Steven was like, "What?" And I was like, "Yeah, I should probably replay it sometime soon." And then all of a sudden, boop, Steven has bought you a game on Steam, Phantasy Star 4.
I take Phantasy Star very seriously. I own it on basically every console I have. If it's available on a console or a handheld that I own, I have it. And I have my Genesis copy that, see, it originally came in a paper box that I didn't like, and as a kid it just got destroyed. But I took the plastic box from another Genesis game and then printed my own box art from this like box art website back in the 90s. And so it looks awesome.
I used to do that too. I had a couple cases of those like the plastic cases that had like the little tabs that snap in.
Yep.
The clear ones. I had a bunch of those. I used to make my own custom cases for. I don't know what happened to them. Like everything else good in my life, I lost it over time.
That's really dark.
No, well, not everything. Everything I had. Oh my god, I had so much awesome game memorabilia, like posters, manuals, strategy guides, stuff that I won from contests, like mail-in stuff, and it is all gone. I had like a copy of Earthbound with the box in it. Anyway,
Wow.
I wish I still had that. Phantasy Star is included in that. I don't have any of those original games anymore.
I was a fool. Not a fool because I was happy I got a PS2, but when PS2 came out, I had to pay for it myself. It was the first console I had to buy myself. And I sold almost everything I owned for Genesis, like Beyond Oasis, Phantasy Star 3, Phantasy Star 2, Shining Force 1 and 2, just everything. The only thing I kept was Phantasy Star 4. And
I did the exact same thing. I sold all of my Super Nintendo games and my system for a Dreamcast I got a Dreamcast and Evolution, and I traded in SNES, Earthbound, Final Fantasy 2 and 3, ActRaiser, everything, like Lufia 1 and 2, everything you could possibly imagine. I had it all, and I got rid of it. And I am filled with the deepest regret to this day.
Big regret, Totemo regret.
I has a regret.
But yeah, Intro to Phantasy Star, it's awesome. I originally had the staff roll, which is a sort of slower paced recap of that track with a really cool breakdown in our playlist, but I took it out just because it's another 2.5 minutes, and I would have rather included something totally different, which we'll see when we get to the last song, what I included in its place. But so our next set of tracks we're going to talk about are the Motavia World Map theme, which is the first world map theme in the game you hear. And then I skipped way ahead to Deseris Town 2 because it's one of my favorite town themes in the game. All of them are, but this one in particular. And because we haven't featured a whole lot of our favorite ice planet, so I want to get that. And then the last track after that is one of the most memorable tracks in the game, is Her Last Breath, which plays when your main character, Chaz, his mentor, but prior to the game, it is insinuated in the manual and other stuff that he was like a street urchin that was like stealing from people and doing bad stuff. And she kind of takes him in and turns him into a hunter and an upstanding citizen. And she gets blasted by one of the bad guys, and basically you can't save her. And this is the song that plays during the actual manga cutouts of her death. So it's really touching. And growing up, I found this scene more tragic than Aerith dying in Final Fantasy VII, just because I played this first, and B, I feel like Elise the dynamic was different. Like, as a young person playing the game, she was the one who was like explaining parts of the world to Chaz, who doesn't get it, and as a surrogate to you. So it's like your own mentor is getting, I don't know. I'm super attached to this game. So
yeah. No, I understand. I was just going to say she was Eris before Eris.
Yeah, and she was better than Eris, but 7's still cool. 7 was my first Final Fantasy, and I love it. But so anyways, Field Motavia, Deseris Town 2, and Her Last Breath. So Her Last Breath, the day I got to that scene, because this game took me, it was kid time, so it was probably like a month, but it felt like 5 years to get through some bosses. I mean, I would get stuck and be stuck for months. I wrote to James Maxlow, the guy who ran the Phantasy Star pages that are still up to this day, and I was like, how do I beat Zio? How do I beat Lashik? I can't do it. And he wrote me back this super nice email and like explained to me like his strategy and what level he recommended and stuff. So that site is really fantastic and is still around, so you should check it out. It's it hasn't been updated in a long time, but he keeps it live. I finally beat the Zio's fort. Alice gets blasted, and then she ends up dying. And I cried like a baby, man. I mean, I was like 5 or 4 or something, and I got so upset. And like I stopped playing for the day, and I was like just miserable. And my family went to Outback that night. I remember they started playing that song, "I Just Died in Your Arms Tonight," in Outback. And I started freaking bawling. And my parents were like, what the hell is wrong? So I was like, I doubt I articulated it appropriately, but the gist of it was the character in my game died, and she was like a mother to me. Yeah, that song is super touching and so far narratively beyond anything in the other games, because you really haven't had a whole lot of like cutscene tracks in Phantasy Star 1 through 3 at all, because there weren't really many cutscenes. 2 had sort of some, 3 had a couple, but no real cutscene tracks. So this is a song made for a cinematic moment, and it was really depressing.
Yeah, really high impact because they specifically crafted that song to go with that moment. And Phantasy Star is now famous, at least Phantasy Star 4 is especially famous for its manga-style anime cutscenes. So every time one of those popped up, you were like, oh, this is serious. Like, this is an important moment, or this is an awesome moment. So when that happened, it not only, it had like the double impact of being one of those scenes that you were always breathless for, her last breath, breathless for. And it was also a really awful, sad moment. And the music and all those things combined, and you're just like, why is this happening?
You've got the manga, the little animated strips of like all the characters crying and wailing. And it's like, no, it's miserable.
I know.
The other 2 tracks I like a lot too, for completely different reasons. They're upbeat. The Motavia theme has that kind of just setting out in this world, and it's mysterious and kind of dying, because after the end of Phantasy Star 2, when you destroy the Mother Brain, who controls the climate control, Motavia is starting to basically desertify, and it kind of has that sort of forlorn vibe to it. And then Deserus Town 2 it's the upbeat track that plays after you fix the climate in Deserus, and you stop the horrible snowstorms by fighting Dark Force 2. So yeah, it's classic tracks.
Yep, they get you in the mood. Next up, we've got some battle stuff and a vehicle song. We've got another chunk of 4 tracks coming up here. The first one is Meet Them Head On, which is the standard battle theme for the game. Interesting track because it's very gritty and fast. It gets right into it, and it's very memorable. One of those songs that everybody who plays the game remembers forever. Followed by the Little Victory jingle. Then there is a Dungeon Arrange track that's actually one of the songs from Phantasy Star 1. And it plays in Phantasy Star 4 in the same dungeon that it appeared in Phantasy Star 1, which is an awesome tie-in. Following that, we have the Illustration Gallery Master AXV25 track that was on the Sega Saturn version of the Phantasy Star collection. It's an arrangement that's really cool. It's one of the vehicle themes. Then we have Cybernetic Carnival, which is the song that actually plays when you get into battles while you're riding in the tank, which is another really neat thing they did. To have a vehicle is one thing, but to have a vehicle that you fight in, awesome. And they made special music to go along with that. So the next set of songs we hope you enjoy. Meet Them Head On. Phantom Head On reminds me of the battles in Motavia more than anything else. Probably because that's the only part of the game that I played over and over and over and over and over as a kid, because I was either too dumb or not tenacious enough to get farther than, apparently like a third of the way through. But I used to
Yeah.
grind on those sandworms and stuff. So every time I hear that, I'm like, yeah, it's time to start my macros. It's time to get that. Is it foie or foe?
I think it's Foe. Like, 'cause
Foe.
if it were Japanese, it'd be Foe.
Okay, sure, whatever. But yeah, casting foe on all the worms.
I was a big fan of Su Foe and Watt because that made Tri-Blaster, which just broke the first half of the game. Well,
Yeah,
first half, but the first time until you got Rune and he broke everything because Rune is
yeah,
the best character in anything.
that's what Rune does though. So
Yes. I love that battle theme. It's actually my least favorite from that game. I think I like Phantasy Star 2's better, but what I like about that is something that's demonstrated in all of these songs so far that I think they struggled with in Phantasy Star 3 is that they had these great compositions, but they struggled to get them on the hardware. Whereas here there's so many layers in these songs. Like with Cybernetic Carnival, you have like 5 or 6 different lines of instrumentation playing different stuff, and right around 24 seconds when it starts going that like the regular like that like I can't possibly describe these sounds, but when it's like like the bass line, it just sounds so cool. I
yeah,
also really like that's not my favorite of the two PS1 dungeon arranges, but in Phantasy Star 1, I like the other dungeon song better, but in Phantasy Star 4, I like this one better. But there are arranges of both the main dungeon themes from the original game in this one, and they're really, really cool that they reach that far back. There are so many connections between all of the games here. Like, they really took this is the culmination of Phantasy Star seriously in this game. I mean, you can go into a dungeon where it talks about the ships that got sent out in Phantasy Star 3. You get history on the destruction of the planet in Phantasy Star 2. You can see statues and go to towns from Phantasy Star 1 that like statues of the heroes. And like in some of the cutscenes, you'll actually see pictures of like Rolf and Elise or Alice, whatever, from Phantasy Star 1. So it's just really well connected. And so that
yeah.
they did that with the music too was really cool.
I absolutely love games that have a really strong sense of world building from title to title. Um, that's probably one of the reasons why I'm so in love with the Trails in the Sky universe, even though I've only gotten to play the first one in English. But that has a really similar, from what I've heard, like the first Trails in the Sky game ends on a cliffhanger, and the rest of them just flesh out the world more and more. And I know that even the latest game that they announced in that series, the Sen no Kiseki, has something to do with the Erebonian Empire. So in a way, that kind of experience is something that Phantasy Star did incredibly well. Because even if the games weren't necessarily connected, like it's the same character from game to game, they still had all those references that made the world feel so cohesive and so alive.
And they really were continuations of the plot because you get Dark Force in each one, and then in the end, it's like, why does he keep coming back? And Phantasy Star 4 goes, well, the reason Dark Force keeps coming back every 1,000 years is because the Profound Darkness, who's sealed away, is slowly weakening the seal that's trapping him in another dimension. And he's become so powerful in 4 that he's able to send 3 Dark Forces into the Algo system. That's why you fight it 3 times. And so the idea is that you have to go into like the dimensional rift in the finale of the game and stop him from coming into Algo and destroy him once and for all. And then for reals end all the problems. Like at the end of Phantasy Star 3, when you kill Dark Force, he's like, ha ha ha, I'll be back in 1,000 years. I'll be sure to tell your children that we'll have a great time. And I'm like, you're super evil, bro. But yeah, great culmination. And I especially like the Land Rover theme arrangement we played. That's from the Sega Saturn Phantasy Star collection that we sadly never got here. But there were these really cool rooms you could go into and watch illustrations, and there were tons of arrangements on that game that played within like the choose which Phantasy Star you want to play system. So it was really neat that they had remixes of that. They have ones for every Phantasy Star that are all great. And if you can locate, or I'm sure it's on YouTube, the Phantasy Star First Series Complete album, they have all the Saturn tracks on there.
It's a good arrangement.
Now, our final little block of tracks. I'm so sad we're at the end of this already. Wow. Our final block of tracks is 3 of my absolute favorite tracks in the game. We're going to play Organic Beat, or Organic Beat as it's incorrectly titled on the soundtrack, which is the track it plays in like Garberg Tower and Zio's Fort. It's like the stuff's about to get real dungeon, like the really dark, evil dungeons. And then we're going to play one of my favorite boss themes of all time, and without a doubt my favorite in this game, the King of Terrors, which is the Dark Force battle theme. It captures this creepy, dark, evil vibe so well. and then we're going to play Ooze, which is the second of the two final battle themes that plays in the final form of the final boss. When it's just like, all right, this is it. Dump everything you got because this boss is going to drop you. Oh man, let's just listen to him now because I'm going to gush, and we don't want to do that too much before we listen. So, Organic Beat, King of Terrors, Ooze. So, before I start just frothing at the mouth over those two boss themes, Organic Beat is. I really like how it has this just that crazy Genesis bass and foreboding that, around 55 seconds it kind of breaks into the Genesis simulated guitar. It just when people say the Genesis can be used to make really cool, really unique music, this is the kind of music they're talking about. That this just isn't possible on a Super Nintendo or the NES. You don't get this kind of sound on there where it's like there's some dude that's just wailing on the super muddy guitar, and at this point in time, that was like unheard of. Final Fantasy had nothing like this. Final Fantasy had awesome music too, but a totally different kind.
It's got such a dark quality that the SNES sound chip doesn't emulate. I love both of this. I love the Genesis and the SNES sound chip. I always say SNES. I feel like I should say SNES. I love both of those, but the Genesis, it's just so gritty, and it's not replicable with the SNES stuff. I don't know.
And you saw with Phantasy Star 3, which had good compositions, but they struggled occasionally with the hardware. But here, that all evidence of that is gone. Like they got it. And then you get the King of Terrors, which is Dark Force is the only boss other than the final boss that has his own battle theme. And it plays all three times, and it's just this slimy, organic, techno evil thing.
Slimy is a really good way to put it.
Like it's got that, like he's made of like this disgusting flesh, and that's exactly what that song evokes. And then you have that like small lull, and then it just totally just breaks down at the end. I love it.
It is quite a track.
All the fights with him start out with like the lights don't fully come on right away. Like when you first see the fight with the first Dark Force, the fight starts and you see the character window pop up, and then you just see the lights from the monitors behind him turn on, and then you see his eyes open, and then the lights totally flash in and your characters show up in the battle. Like there was some real cinematic stuff happening here, and the music just that opening couple of seconds where it's really foreboding, it's super well done. The final boss track though, like I said to Derek while we were listening, first of all, this is probably why I like bass and drama, because that song is just like nothing but synth bass and just wailing guitars, and this is like the best graphics they can pull off on Genesis. Like the background is this crazy flashing, just lights everywhere, just super crazy effects, full screen boss sprite, and you just have it's so weighty in the bass, and it sounds like you sit there and you realize this is the antagonist that has caused every problem in the entire series. So this is the showdown. Like this is it. This is literally it lives up to its name. It's the end of the millennium. This is the final boss fight. So that it gets that kind of song that capitalizes on everything that series has ever had as a strength and the strength of its hardware. I mean, what else do you say, man? It's awesome.
It's pretty flawless, I'd say. I mean, it's the perfect accompaniment to that fight. The series is amazing because of those kinds of things, those kinds of elements coming together and making such an awesome experience. And like you said, how cinematic it was for the time. I've seen the final boss. I haven't actually gotten to it myself. For shame, but I'll rectify that soon because this episode is making me itch something fierce and not down there in my heart.
I picked Ooze because that's the last track we're playing for the day, and I figured that it culminates the series, culminates our episode. So it's pretty good, I think. This is a series that a lot of people were disappointed when it went to the online. I was too, but I learned to love the online series for totally different reasons. Even though there are plenty of throwbacks, especially musically, in Phantasy Star Online to the new series, or to the older series. And you have a lot of references and things like that. So it's not like they've totally forgotten, but I often say, people often say, oh, I'd love to see Phantasy Star 5, but sometimes I wonder if they could capture that same thing because so much of what made it special was them creating these new kinds of experiences within the limitations of their hardware. Like the manga style cutscenes were fantastic back in the day, but now we can do anime. So, and if they created a Phantasy Star 5 and made, if it just had behind the back turn-based combat and anime cutscenes, that's like every half the JRPGs released now. So, it would take a lot to recreate what was once so great about that. And I am curious if anybody could truly capture that. They did with Skies of Arcadia. Skies of Arcadia felt like, it was the same director, Reiko Kodama, but I'd be hesitant.
I'd still like to see it. As much as I'm also afraid of them absolutely ruining it, if it was put in the right hands, I really think they could make something magical and continue with the series. For now, I'm happy to check out Phantasy Star Online too if they would ever give us a release date for that in the US.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is at least happy is that the series got a conclusion. Like, it's not like we were left with cliffhanger. Like,
Right.
everything wrapped up, the bad guy is defeated. So for all intents and purposes, they finished the story. So it's not like we're sitting here, without the second half of Shining Force 3, for example, or the second 2/3 of Shining Force 3. So
Right. Yep.
it'd be worse.
Not
But so that finishes up with Phantasy Star for the day. Again, stay tuned for episode 4. That's going to be the modern series of Phantasy Star. But in the meantime, we're not going to do releases, as I said earlier, because we covered all of March's releases in the last episode, and we don't want to keep recapping the same thing. But we do have some news stories that I believe Derek has so graciously researched and will drop on us. So
most definitely. One of the ones that's most appropriate is there's actually a Phantasy Star Symphony concert coming in late March to Japan. Of course, to Japan. It's going to be called Sympathy 2013. And it is going to feature music throughout the history of the series, including the classic Genesis titles, which is awesome because we just heard all of that. So we know how good it is.
So if they release an album, we'll review it and get to play it again.
Yeah, that's going to be happening on March 30th, which is right around the time this episode is going to go up on the site. So it's going to be hosted by Yuji Naka of Sega fame and Seiyu/voice actress Atsuko Enomoto. So we will definitely be looking for that and seeing if there's a recording of that, because it's the kind of thing we will want to share with you guys if possible.
But not before I listen to it myself.
But not before we listen to it ourselves.
I love you guys, but not as much as me.
Yeah, you don't want to keep Steven from Phantasy Star. All right, so just two other things. Drakengard 3 was announced, and we did talk about that a bit on Random Encounter as far as the actual game and its pedigree and all that. But what's relevant to us here on Rhythm Encounter is that it's going to have the same composer, Keiichi Okabe, who did the music for Nier. And I believe he did the music for Drakengard 1 and 2. That could be wrong. But I'm sure that he did the music for Nier, and that game had a flawless soundtrack. I believe it's also one of our most clicked reviews in our entire music section. So people definitely like that music. And if Okabe returns and does anything close to the level of what he did for Nier in Drakengard 3, then we have something really awesome to look forward to.
I'm pretty sure that Emmy Evans and Monaka will be back as a whole. So I think it's literally the same team that was behind Nier. So I could be wrong if that's been announced or not, but I'm almost positive that's what I heard. So, yeah, if you liked Nier, you have something to look forward to. And I just double-checked. Dragon Dragoon Drakengard 1 was actually... It doesn't look like it was composed by Keiichi Okabe, but even so, that game did have cool music, so you should listen to that too.
And the final news item today that I wanted to touch on is many of you, of course, have heard that Kingdom Hearts is getting an HD re-release in Kingdom Hearts HD 1.5 Remix. And Steven's giddy about that. That's going to be coming out later this year in North America. We found out for sure recently. But something really awesome that we didn't know at first is that the music in the game has been re-recorded with live instruments by Gakudan.
Oh, yes.
And it is gorgeous.
Yes, you can hear... People have posted their playthrough videos on YouTube, and then a couple of the tracks. Lord of the Castle from Rechain of Memories is unbelievable with live instruments, and the Hollow Bastion theme, the final boss theme, all of it just sounds incredible. And the Disney tracks sound great too. So I have to give Square Enix props. We rib on them all the time for re-releasing in their crappy iOS games, but at the very least, they're doing justice with these ports, and they're not just resting on their laurels doing it. I mean, they tweak the game, and I mean, the one thing that sold to me was that updated soundtrack, and it sounds fantastic. So I'm going to buy it. That sealed the deal.
Yeah, I actually wasn't 100% sure if I wanted to buy it when they first announced it, but after considering trophy support and especially the new music, oh my god, I'm definitely going to pick that up. Between that and 10.2 HD Remaster, it is going to be an awesome fall-winter season for playing those classic games on your PS3. And that's all the news I have for today. Just a couple little things here. So we'll have more news and probably an updated release schedule in the next episode, since that should be in early to mid-April.
So I very much hope you enjoyed our slavering, fanboyish look back at the Phantasy Star series. This was something that was always going to happen when this show was conceived. So I'm glad we were able to finally get it out there. As usual, if you have any suggestions for how we can improve, ideas for topics, anything you want to hear, you can email Derek or I. Our addresses are listed on the Rhythm Encounter page now. We are working on getting an actual Rhythm Encounter at RPG fan email address, but as of yet we don't have one. But as soon as we do, it will be on that page. So For the meantime, you can contact us or anybody else, and you can rate us on iTunes. We are available on there, and nobody appears to have rated us yet. So go and make iTunes think that we are super awesome. So
Make us happy.
yes, I mean I'm already happy. I got to talk about Phantasy Star for 2 hours, but
Well, yeah.
you get the gist of it.
Yeah, stroke our egos a little bit, just a little bit, please.
Yes, I mean more than you already have. So our final track, our editor-in-chief Eric Ferran couldn't be on, or our former editor-in-chief Eric Ferran couldn't be on today, but since he is the most long-running Phantasy Star fan on the site, I would say, I gave him the option of picking our final track since we decided we'd have a guest or someone else do it. And there was an album released called Hyperdrive GSM Sega 4, which I actually wasn't familiar with, and Eric told me that there were some remixes of Phantasy Star music on there. And there's a really great remix of the Phantasy Star 3 main theme called The Journey Begins. And so that's what's going to be taking us out today.
Thank you guys again for listening to another episode of Rhythm Encounter, the RPG Fan Music Podcast. Definitely tune in again soon to hear more coverage and ridiculous love spewing all over your favorite classic RPG tunes. And we can't wait to get your feedback and to continue recording.
So taking us out, Eric's choice, The Journey Begins, Phantasy Star 3 main theme.